Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Noire Histoir. I'm Natasha, and today I am going to be discussing my trip to Birmingham, specifically the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. The Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, it's located in the historic civil rights area of downtown Birmingham. I believe within the area that was traditionally the Black Business District. So essentially when you walk into the museum, there's like a way that you progress through the museum. Like it's not a free-for-all kind of thing. When you first walk in, it begins with an 8-minute film that transitions visitors into the museum. When you first walk into the museum, the first area following the film, they're like these dioramas, right? So essentially, some of them show you what the environments would have been like for Black versus white people. So if you've ever seen like the Jim Crow pictures, so like the whites only water fountain and the Black colored water fountain, where like the whites only water fountain is like all nice and everything and modern looking, and it looks like the water's probably clean and cold. And then you have the colored water fountain that's like all old and raggedy and whatnot. The dioramas were sort of along those lines. So you had physical representations of the water fountains, then there's like a representation of what classrooms look like. So the classroom of like the segregated white school, it's like pretty nice and clean looking. The chairs and desks look really new. The textbooks are new. Everything's like in good condition. And then you have the colored classroom where it's like the desks look kind of old. It's not necessarily dirty, but it just looks like they've had them since they said, let's make a desk or let's make a classroom. The stuff looks really old. The textbooks look like all worn out and whatnot. And you notice like, it's a really great visual representation of the fallacy of the separate but equal ideology, right? That they were separate, but things certainly weren't equal. As you move on through the exhibits, there's those like the Jim Crow dioramas, but then there's also scenes from everyday Black life. So they're like photos from like local music venues and theaters and things like that, gathering places, social places where Black people would frequent to relax and unwind, as well as sort of like a model of a barbershop or a beauty salon, which were some of the businesses that Black people usually started. Black people couldn't go to like white barbershops or white beauty salons, so they'd start their own businesses. And through starting their own businesses, that was one of the ways Black people in Birmingham built wealth for themselves or created jobs for themselves, as generally within mainstream society, they would kind of be held to menial, low-paying jobs, relegated to positions that wouldn't really allow them an opportunity to move up economically or to be very financially secure. A lot of the people in the area worked for mines and mills in the community. And through Jim Crow and racism, they were usually relegated to the most dangerous and physically demanding jobs. And then to top that off, they were also paid pretty lowly. Not really allowed to move into management type positions that would be a little bit less physically demanding and more financially rewarding. So Black people made up the majority of the workforce, but, were kind of limited as far as what their employment options were within mainstream society. So as a result, Birmingham's Black community created its own business district in the, like downtown area. I'm not very familiar with like the streets and stuff like that, but I believe it's from 3rd to 5th Avenue. And north from 16th to 18th Avenue. So right where the Civil Rights Institute is located, that's like where the Black Business District was. Within the museum, there's like a lot of photographs. there's like these overhead pictures that really give you an idea of what the city looked like back then. There's placards and things like that that explain how Black people were sort of limited to certain parts of the city. Like they were limited as far as where they could live, sort of pushed out to the outskirts of town where they wouldn't have access to like city resources. And by being relatively distant from the city, they were made to live in or alongside places where you wouldn't really want to live, like next to railroad tracks and things like that. Places where like sort of eyesores, you know, like you don't want your house next to these things. I mean, you might make use of them or they might be useful to the community, but you don't necessarily want to live next to these places. The museum explained those things, but it really helped drive home the point by being able to look at old photographs of just how the city was laid out and, you know, what the houses looked like at that time, like really small and ramshackle, sort of raggedy looking. The houses were cramped and very close together. Some of them looked like they were on the verge of falling apart. You know, that really helped to drive home that point. Neighborhoods usually sprang up next to where people worked. Those would be like how the neighborhoods developed. Neighborhoods were definitely segregated socially, right? So it's like you'd have a white enclave or a white neighborhood, and generally because of Jim Crow and racism and things like that, you wouldn't really have Black people living there, right, socially. But then there was also legal segregation where zoning ordinances and things like that restricted, like legally restricted where Black people could live. Beyond work, inequality was also present in other facets of society. So, not just employment opportunities, but medical care. And then even in instances where people were allowed to work, like, for example, let's say, in the school system, there was inequality in salaries, right? So, and I read about this in The Warmth of Other Suns, where essentially you'd be working in the same school system because you're in the same city. And, you know, the school system receives its funding from taxes and the state and things like that. But then institutional inequality allowed for what would most likely be a Black teacher at a Black school to make far less than a white teacher at the segregated white school. So you had income inequality in those situations. There was the way that the museum represents these inequalities and like the percentages and things like that were actually very creative. For example, because of the limitations that were placed on Black society, there's a difference in the amount of blue collar versus white collar workers. And that's represented by blue and white shirts, I believe it is. So like sort of blue uniform type shirts that you might be used to seeing versus like, you know, like your white suit shirts that men might typically wear. There's a stop along the way in the museum where it's about like the justice system and legal cases that help to uphold segregation and the denial of voting rights are explained in short blurbs on flip cards. So in front of, I think it's like a judge's bench or something like that, there's like this flip book thing, and you flip through and each one of the cards has information about an important court case and how like it helped to uphold segregation, or eventually over time how winning these court cases helped to overturn Jim Crow laws and segregation and things like that. The blurbs were short and easy to read, and it made it easier to take in what was a lot of information. The museum covers different facets of society and life via scenes and buildings that you as the visitor walk through. There's a collection of racist ads and promos featuring stereotypical caricatures of Black people. So not just the injustices that Black people faced in society, but then also beyond that, the stereotypes and negativity that they experienced and that was portrayed about them in media. It showed how representation in movies and popular cultures helped to influence perception of Black people. sort of reinforcing the racism and stereotypes that were already present in society. Sort of like a cycle, right? Where you have these beliefs that are held in general society that are then reflected in media. And then those things in media reinforce what's the views held by society, which then is again reflected by media. So you just had like this constantly repeating cycle of negativity and racism. Once you get through those dioramas, like there's still a lot more content. There's the bus boycott section, which talks about the boycott in Montgomery. And then following that, there's the freedom rider section. So there are actually like a lot of photos from the time, as well as models of the Greyhound buses that were featured in these campaigns. What was something actually quite interesting is that there's a timeline, right, of the different events that took place during these campaigns, leading up to and then during the campaigns of Freedom Summer and the bus boycott. And there's also the front of a life-sized firebombed bus. And throughout that portion of the exhibit, there's information about and photos from the sit-ins, as well as voter registration drives and on through into the civil rights movement. I actually really enjoyed the civil rights timeline. It's really huge and spans quite a few rooms in the museum. A lot of information packed in. At that point, I didn't get to read everything because time was kind of winding down, but it's a wealth of information, sort of like on this day, you know, in this year, such and such event kind of happened. Very granular. But it was split into, I believe, if not Alabama, I think like Birmingham, like on this day. So it's like you have the timeline moving along the wall. On one side of the timeline, you have what's going on around the country, right? Like a more national perspective. And then on the other side of the timeline, you have specific events that took place locally, right? Within the state, within the city. So, it helped to provide like a really detailed timeline of the events throughout the civil rights movement, leading up to and then on through the civil rights movement. The museum ends sort of closer to the present, so it moves on into the 70s, and then once you end what's like, I would say once you reach the end of what I would say is like the major timeline, you move out into another room where that features a shorter timeline from like the 90s. So information about events that took place in the 90s, convictions and things like that related to the firebombing of the the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. That there were additional developments in the 90s. So there's a little bit about that. The 90s section is quite smaller and it's sort of separated from the rest of it, but I would take it that, some of that stuff happened more recently and it might have been added in later on. At the very end of the museum, or the end of the museum experience, it concludes with a pretty lively and interesting video about the Birmingham Children's Crusade. So essentially, during the civil rights movement, it was like the adults had pretty much all been arrested and locked up, right? Like there aren't a lot more of them to be arrested. So essentially what happened was school children ranging in age essentially ditched school over the course of a few days and marched from, I believe it was the 16th Street Baptist Church, or somewhere thereabout, was like the gathering place. And they would all march off in groups of, I think it was like 100, something like that. And would just constantly march in these waves of spaced out groups. And it was a way of bringing attention to what was going on in Birmingham. And they ended up being arrested, and then it helped to bring further attention to what was going on in Birmingham to, from people all around the country and also around the world that, here are these kids marching and, they also experienced having dogs sicked on them and fire hoses turned on them and things like that. And unlike with adults where, you might be sympathetic with that, there's something even more troubling about these kinds of things happening to children. So pretty much the museum experience ends with a video about the Children's Crusade. So it's, obviously they were children at the time, but they're now very much so adults, talking about their experiences of what it was like during that time growing up, of what it was like, the excitement, of essentially cutting school for, I guess, what would be considered a good cause, and, dealing with their parents and teachers and stuff like that, some of whom discouraged them from participating, and, what it was like to be marching and things like that. So it was pretty interesting. I thought it was obviously it started out from a negative place, right? Because you're dealing with inequality, but I thought it was uplifting to see, like these kids taking a stand. Some of it was upsetting to see, like, dogs attacking children and grown people turning fire hoses on kids, but it was actually pretty balanced, right? I found you left the museum feeling optimistic about the future, then at least feeling positive, if not optimistic about the future, then feeling some degree of that, this heaviness of, moving through all of this negativity, seeing these kids stand up for themselves and seeing them smiling and describing their experiences. Like it sort of left me with like a pretty balanced feeling. So I wasn't like, sad and depressed when I left. I certainly wasn't happy either, but I think, it sort of helped to balance out the heaviness of the rest of the museum. On your way out of the museum, you can see out onto the street. You can see Kelly Ingram Park across the street. It was like a gathering place during the Civil Rights Movement. Across the street, you have the 16th Street Baptist Church, at which, the 4 little girls were murdered during, the bombing. It's still a functioning church at present, but if you contact them in advance, I believe it's possible to arrange to visit and tour the inside of the church. I would say for the museum itself, allow yourself 3 to 4 hours to see the museum. Keep in mind that there are no bags allowed. When I arrived, I didn't know that in advance, and I'd brought my camera, but I was able to go into, I think it's like the security office or something like that. They gave me a ticket and I was able to check in my bag. So I left my bag there, and, we just went on into the museum pretty much just to avoid the headache of it. Carry with you what you can actually carry with. Thanks again for tuning in, and I hope you return to watch future episodes. For more information about Noire Histoir, visit the Noire Histoir website. There you'll find text, video, and audio for each episode all in one place. Subscribe to the Noire Histoir newsletter to get fresh content delivered straight to your email inbox. You can also subscribe to the Noire Histoir YouTube channel for videos. If you're enjoying the content but would prefer to listen to audio, you can subscribe to the Noire Histoir podcast via iTunes, Apple Music, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, and SoundCloud. If you subscribe, please also take a few minutes to rate and review the show in iTunes. Follow Noire Histoir on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. Enjoy the rest of your day.